Let me know when I can take off.
You can take off. You're good to go.
All right, no introduction. I'm just going to jump in, introduce myself. How many people we got?
50. About 50 people.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm really glad to be here, glad to be part of this conference. I presented before I think in this conference before, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that I do, and I think and how it relates to the conference theme. I'm going to go through a number of slides and just talk about some of the work that I do. My name is Michael Yellowbird. I am in Canada, on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg, Manitoba, the homelands of the Lakota, the Anishinaabe, the Cree, Ojai-Cree, the Dene people, and also the Métis people. So I'm here, I'm actually from Fort Berthold, from 3 affiliated tribes, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Rikara. And been up here for about 4 years, but I want to share some of my work with you. I hope it's helpful to you. So I've got a number of slides, and I'll just go ahead and share my screen right now. So just let me know if you can see my screen.
We can see it.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
All right. So I want to just start, real quickly, just to say that, the work that I do is around contemplative practices and mindfulness and traditional, how they work in a traditional aspect, and how being mindful, practicing meditation or any kind of traditional contemplative practice can be very powerful healing avenues and approaches. This is my oldest daughter here. She's a little older than that now. She was about 11 when we took this picture. She's now 15. So, but she was meditating ever since she was little. I've got 4 grown sons and 4 little girls. They're all meditators. And the reason they meditate is because I understand how important it is in terms of dealing with stress, and how important it is with regard to improving health and changing the structure and function of the brain. So my first slide here is a medicine wheel that I developed and put different areas in there that we don't normally see, like in the mind. I used in the body and the spirit and the emotions. So what I put in there in the mind is neuroplasticity, the term. It's a Western term about neuro meaning the neurons in the brain, and plasticity meaning that the brain can change at any time in our lives. When we start learning a new language, learning a new song, learning a new dance, learning new information, and we practice that information over and over again, our brain changes to accommodate that. So we get better and better at that. We grow these neurons that help us facilitate learning, facilitate skills, whatever it may be. It's everything from positivity to trauma. Negativity, ends up in our neural networks. We practice a lot of traumatic thinking and a lot of negative thinking. We grow more neurons of negativity and more neurons of trauma. If we practice a lot of resilience in our thinking and in the way we approach the world, and we visualize, positivity and say positive words and do positive activities, we change the neural networks in the brain so that the networks in the brain become more endowed with neurons that help facilitate the regulation and the growth of positivity or negativity in the brain. So the body, I'm not going to talk much about the human microbiome because there's a lot to talk about there. I'm going to talk maybe a little bit about genetics. I've got a lot of slides on genetics and epigenetics, which I think are very valuable, but I don't get to that to the very end, so I don't want to take too much of your time. But what I'm going to talk more about today are the indigenous mindfulness contemplative practices, and how we can heal and transform from the diseases of colonization by discovering our ancestral knowledge and practices. And that means, sort of figuring out, what different areas that we need to do here. So I'm going to move ahead, with this everyday stress. We know is, we should do a check-in with ourselves every day. Where are we in a good space? some things are bothering me, but I can still focus, or I can't manage my emotions or behaviors. What does that all mean for us? And when we do that stress test, every day, our check, if we looked at chronic stress, there's a lot of things that the research shows that results in our in different conditions in our body, and we start to get these different strains and imbalances, in our body. And there's a lot of physical ones that appear right away, like muscle aches, headaches, later on heart disease, focus and memory, kind of fade in and out. We get forgetful. Sleep disturbances right now is a chronic issue among all populations almost around the world, except for maybe hunter-gatherers that still live in rainforests or live in areas that are kind of untouched by industrial, westernization. Digestive issues, huge. It's a huge industry right now. A lot of people have digestive problems and take a lot of what they call proton pump inhibitors to deal with the, this issues around excess, gas and acid, reflux diseases and those kinds of things, Crohn's disease, all these different kinds of things. And of course, we see the rise of a lot of different kinds of cancers, of the gastrointestinal system that really weren't there before, meaning things like colon cancer. You see a lot of young people dying from colon cancer. That could be partially genetic, but it's also partially epigenetic, where when you eat the wrong foods, you don't get enough of the right clean proteins and macro and micro nutrients, and not enough fiber like our ancestors did, then it becomes an issue. Most of us live in a world where there's a lot of processed foods and a lot of additives in their foods. And so, of course, we're going to get digestive issues. You couple that with chronic stress, what happens with a lot of people is then they up their game. And one of the things that people go to right away to deal with stress is a lot of sugary, high carb foods in order to kind of fill in those missing gaps in the brain where the glucose has been compromised, right? Irritability, anxiety, those are all really parts of chronic stress. I don't know what it really is among Indian nations, but when I think about this, when I see this American Psychological Association sort of output here, that when we're talking about chronic stress, 33% of employees experience chronic stress. I would venture to say that's higher among some groups, much higher among some groups of employees than others. Especially if you work for Twitter, I guess these days, if you follow Twitter, a lot of chronic stress there, where Elon Musk is probably firing a lot of people and so on. But that's, if you don't have enough, you don't have a living wage, which tends to be in marginalized populations and reservations and communities of people of color and BIPOC populations, and tend to 28% and tend to change jobs due to stress. Some people are trying to find, jobs where there isn't so much stress. The pandemic has been helpful for a lot of people because, on the one hand, if you didn't lose your job, you were at a different kind of place where you didn't have to go to work every day, but you probably spent more screen time than ever before. 75% of visits are due to stress, doctor visits. I can only imagine what it must look like when you look at, our people, reservation communities where there's all these different levels of stress. And 5 to 8% of healthcare costs are stress related. Again, these are just kind of the average. And of course, among marginalized populations, indigenous people, and so on, we're going to see a very different kind of output there, printout. So when I think about things like historical trauma and the starvation that different indigenous people went through, being rounded up and put on reservations, starvation conditions on those reservations, sent to boarding school where kids were fed starvation diets and were abused and beaten. That doesn't go away in one generation or two generations. We know now from the research that a lot of those traumas follow us through life, and it can actually change, genetic expression through epigenetic expression. So if you've got some particular genetic variants you're carrying, that code for diabetes, or that code for tumors, or that code for migraine headaches, or whatever it could be. Those kinds of things, may be in the genes, but, may not be activated. But once you start experiencing poverty or hate crimes or uncertainty or threats and intimidation, and chronic stress for a long period of time, then it can begin to express, in different ways in people. So, and then what I wanted to talk about is, what does it look, the deepest trauma look like? Not only the loss of a child, but the loss of many community members that you've never grieved, or the loss of community members or ancestors that, died in these horrible ways, and so on. So those kinds of things, I think, are part of the epigenetic profile. When we think about it, I think about molecular colonization. That's what I call it. The molecular systems in the body get colonized because of hate crimes, because of colonization, because of the foods we eat, and because of the lack of sleep and our uncertainty and those kinds of things. So I say trauma is plastic, just like brain plasticity. It can change, from being traumatic one day to even more traumatic, in a year or 2 years later, because of added stress from different kinds of sources. And it's really about severe emotional, mental, or physical distress caused by these overwhelming negative experiences, right? Molecular colonization is really, thinking about this decay that's going on, this destruction that's happening at the smallest level of our bodies, right? These extremely minute particles or molecular tiny mass, is what you see in this particular picture, between this particular DNA here that's happening, right? DNA doesn't really get changed, unless it's you're exposed to like nuclear radiation or something. But genes are change the expression. So in this particular slide here, let me see if I can get a full slide here. I'm sorry, I didn't get the full slide here. I've got this. There, okay. Sorry about that. I had this other. In this particular slide here, think about it for a second. You've got a prefrontal cortex in your brain, and your brain's very delicate. Our brains are very delicate, but they're also resilient in certain kinds of ways. But we now know how delicate they are when it comes to stress and chronic stress and all the events that come from chronic stress. Some people talk about ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and how they sort of pile up. And I think this is a good representation of these experiences that children have. And I've got some more slides. I call this enzymatic colonization, because when we're chronically stressed, like with hate crimes and those kinds of things, our brain is flooded with this kinase C, which is this enzyme. And too much of it for too long then begins to break down these delicate dendritic spines in the brain. And let's see here if I got a laser pointer. Okay. So what you see here these are the spines here, and they're pretty delicate. But what happens over the course of a lifetime is that these spines, grow. Like here's a formed spine that this young person here in adolescence formed a spine there. And maybe the spine was a spine of fear or learning something new. And then by early adulthood, they didn't use that, or something traumatic happened. So it was pruned, and into adulthood, they didn't have it. Another one could be like language, for instance, the sensory experience in the learning of language, right? And then at the early postnatal comes adolescence, and the child becomes more and more adept at speaking the language. Early adulthood stays there, and by older adulthood, it's still there, and into aging, the person remembers their language. But certain kinds of things, like I said, can prune them. Where you have this particular dendritic spine, which was, because let's say it's one of happiness, it's kind of a sensory experience of happiness, adolescence, but something traumatic happens, so it gets pruned, and it never does come back at this point here, right? So I'm kind of simplifying it a bit, but this is really how it works, right? And so they're associated with memory and learning. And when we have chronic stress, enzymatic colonization happens, so it just floods the brain and begins to break them down. And once they're beginning to break down, then we sort of begin to, our learning and our experiences, begin to be compromised, right? And that's the important thing to remember, that, because we need those spines, because they're very important to our sensory experience and our learning, right? this is, you see this in learning. Fear conditioning increases spine elimination and frontal association cortex, and increases spine formation in the primary auditory cortex. So it could be that, what's happening in the frontal association cortex is that we're no longer associating, that fear with anything because it's overwhelmed us, right? So what's happening now is there's more spine formation in the hearing cortex. So we're maybe listening for the danger, right? And we're, hearing those kinds of things that remind us of the danger. That's the learning point of it. So trauma does that, to that part of our brain, and that's part of the molecular part of our brain. We know that there are differences in terms of pruning those dendritic spines. Men and women have different experiences when they have trauma, and the spines are decreased in density at different rates for genders. This is one particular study. I don't know if it's cross-sectional across cultures or global across the world, but it was one study. We also know this: a rich environment increases spine density. So that's a critical thing, right? You want to stay healthy, you need to have a rich environment. That means learning new languages, learning new things, exercising, sleeping well, being around people that tell great jokes, or listening to music, or dancing, anything that's a really rich environment where there's learning and feelings of safety and really powerful sensory experiences happening, right? Dendritic spines are really important because we should know this, is that they provide some resilience and protection against Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. That's been a study that has kind of really sort of made people pay attention to that, in terms of stress, that stress is a contributor to dementias and so on. One of the things, the good news is that, even though we've gone through a lot of chronic stress, they can repair once the stress is eliminated. Okay. Colonizing the telomere. The telomere is this red part. This is young chromosome, and this is grandpa chromosome, right? It's a little deceptive, and I'll tell you why. Because this part of the chromosome is called a telomere. The telomere is the part that protects the chromosome in different ways, and really what it does is it protects genetic data. It makes it possible for our cells to divide, and kind of really lets us know, how we're going to age. As long as our telomeres are longer, we're going to age slower and more healthily, and we're going to be less likely to get cancer, right? That's not always true, because sometimes you get genetic cancers or stuff, but for the most part, you want to keep them long. So when the cells divide, right, telomeres get shorter, and when the telomeres get too short, cells can no longer divide. That means aging sort of sets in, right? So we want to keep the telomeres longer. So the cells become inactive or senescent, right? That's what they call them. They don't really die, but they're senescent, meaning that the cells are in the body. And if your body's not eating them up, and getting rid of them, they begin to kind of build up in your body. Some of us kind of have that issue already, like I do. I'm one of those people that has to watch myself, because I have a genetic variant where I would build up more cells in my body and they won't die. And if I build up too many, then I'll get a blood cancer that I have in my genetic line, right? Some kind of blood cancer. But I know there's a fix for that. And part of the fix is fasting, right? Fasting, when we fast and when we go without food for periods of time, and for 3 days, or fast every day for 17 or 18 hours between meals, the body goes into a state of what they call autophagy. Auto meaning body, and phagy meaning eating. So our body's not really eating we're not really eating our body, but we're eating all of the unnecessary senescent cells and molecular structures and proteins and junk DNA that's all dead and laying around in there. That's the first thing on the menu of our body. Our bodies, we've been gifted this beautiful body if we work with it. So anyway, the shortening of the telomeres then is associated with higher rates of cancer, diabetes, tumors, and aging, all those kinds of things. And you look at this picture, you see that the young telomere has longer ones, which we would expect, unless there's a telomere disease, and grandpa has shorter ones. However, grandpa can have nice long telomeres if grandpa exercises, eats well, and doesn't go to bingo too often. No, I'm just kidding about that. But gets the right nutrients, and maybe goes into a sauna or a sweat lodge, 3 or 4 times a week, and goes through this mild bioenergetic stress and fasts and all these different kinds of things, right? Or even runs, right? So that's what we know about molecular colonization of the telomeres at the end of the chromosome. Particular studies showed that middle-aged people who were physically active not only had longer telomeres, but better aerobic capacities than people who were sitting around. Now that really should give a signal to us, because most of us spend a lot of time sitting around, and even exercising for an hour a day, the research is showing, is not enough. I mean, you need to put in at least 3 hours a day, exercise for your hour and a half in the morning, and then for lunch, go for a walk, and you get home in the evening, another hour walk or something, or just stand up and do your housework and stay away from the TV until, for maybe an hour, or stay off the computer. But that's the kind of thing that, telling us the hazards of living in the Western world now. So these folks who were, physically active had telomere lengths that were similar to people that were younger than they were. We know something else too, is that the power of stress and depression, telomere lengths are really shortest for people who are depressed and healthy, who are showing chronic stress, meaning that even though you're healthy and you're walking and maybe, whatever, and you're trying to eat the right foods and whatnot, you're probably going to be missing your sleep. You're probably going to be having feelings of like anxiety. Your body's going to read that. Even though you feel like you're pretty healthy and so on, your telomere lengths are going to start to shrink, because they've been colonized by this stress and this trauma. So that's how powerful stress is. You can be depressed and healthy, right? But you can still be showing chronic stress. So if you're depressed and healthy, right, sometimes there isn't a difference, right? But anyway, go down to the last part here. Depressed participants in this particular study also exhibited, this what they call cortisol dysregulation, right? Meaning that they're always on alert, they're always thinking about things, they're always ruminating. There's always this chatter going on in their head. You're not good enough. You can't pay your bills. Something bad is going to happen, and what they call catastrophizing, right? And there's some good studies have been done around introspection theory and why we do that. And it's not that, even healthy people can have what they call intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts can be like, you're just sitting there and all of a sudden you think you want to push somebody off out of a building or something, right? And people say, well, I never think that. But if you don't, then you're one of a very small population of people that don't think, have intrusive thoughts where you might want to harm someone or yourself, or you think things that, are so out of character for you. But that's been studied. So we already have that piece. But if you add on depression, you add anxiety and hate crimes and poverty, all those kinds of things, the depression is going to be more increased. And of course, for some people, it's going to disturb their cortisol regulation. And cortisol is one of those, stay alert, something's going to happen, get ready to run. And you can feel it in your chest. You can feel it, in your legs. You can't sleep well because your cortisol levels are too high. And things like that I'm going to talk about in just a minute are the things that, are going to kind of be antidotes for that. This is another one about early life stress in kids. Think about that, little kids, in your community and your homes and your schools and that we see, if they're in a stressful situation, they encode certain neurotransmitters that heighten the effect of stress, things like norepinephrine and cortisol. Some of these things really, increase the stress even more, right? They make you more alert, they make you more nervous, they make you more, on guard and so on. This particular study showed that kids living in the most stressful environments, that really, where they had a lot of worry, they, maybe someone was coming home that was intoxicated, or they were looking at their, they weren't being watched, so they got their laptops out and they were watching all these scary things or these bizarre things on, on YouTube or TikTok or whatever. That creates stress for them, right? They don't understand, right? And even those of us that watch a scary movie will still have those dreams about it. So add that piece onto the poverty, onto the uncertainty and all these other things. Those kids in this particular study had telomeres on the average that were 40% shorter than those kids that lived in the most nurturing and loving settings. And in fact, since we know now that shorter telomeres increases the signs of aging, that those kids, because of that stress, are becoming little old people way before their time. They're going to get diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, different kinds of cancers. Those kinds of things are going to express when there's in these environments. You add on to that smoking cigarettes or being in a place where there is pollutants or not clean air and so on, it's going to increase, the wearing down of the telomeres even more. So these are the things we have to really pay attention to, because when kids are out there, we can't see that. That's happening to them. It's happening at that molecular level. One thing we know from the research from Elizabeth Blackburn's research, and Elizabeth Blackburn is a Nobel Prize winner on her telomere research. I think in 2015, she won the Nobel Prize for her work on the telomeres. She knows that it's not only overweight mothers, but it's mothers who are stressed give birth to babies that are biologically older, meaning that they're biologically older, meaning that they have shorter telomeres than other babies that are born, from mothers who are not overweight. So the stress of carrying the weight is also something that's really damaging, to moms. I was one of those babies. I did my DNA test. I did my mom's DNA test. My mom passed away in 2021 during the pandemic at age 94, but she had a lot of stress in her life. So when I did her DNA analysis and I looked at it and I looked at mine, I said, wow, we're almost identical in terms of our telomeres. We had all these genes that came up that showed, we had possibility of shorter telomeres. And she was a person who was thin most of her life. She grew up, she was born in 1927. But when she started having kids in her early 20s, she was thin for a long time. And then when they moved out of kind of where they were before, they were kind of living a more traditional life, farming life and a gardening life. They moved into White Shield, which is our community, start getting all these commodities and eating all these processed foods. And boy, she put on a lot of weight and ended up getting diabetes. And so I was one of those kids that was kind of at the tail end of that. The kids, probably didn't inherit these shorter telomeres like I did. Anyway, we know that that's how close the relationship is between mom and baby. Well, there's a lot of factors that really contribute to shorter telomeres, for mom that can pass on to babies, right? To baby. If they experience hate crimes, they don't even have to experience them directly. They can just read about them and kind of see themselves in that situation. Remember, I talked about chatter in the brain. If you just imagine yourself being in that place, or imagine some of your family members being in that place who are vulnerable, it's creating this epigenetic response in yourself, so that you could be, for all intents and purposes, your brain could be reading that this really happened to me when it didn't, but your thoughts, your brain is taking those thoughts and kind of using them in that way, because you're using certain neurons to kind of build a visualization, to build a memory, to build a picture, to build whatever the hate crime is. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, different kinds of abuse, the lack of safety, poverty, isolation, violence, against Native women, mocking of Native women, ridicule, exclusion, marginalization, stereotyping, Indigenous women, sex trafficking. Like I said, their fear, lack of safety, or these different tropes of means of hate, like the Indian princess or the squaw, the drudge, were for a long time, right? For a long time. And maybe we don't hear those as often, but if our mothers did, and our grandmothers did, our great grandmothers did, those shorter telomeres could have passed down, 3 or 4 or 5 generations, right? Down to us, like my mom's did. And I know my grandmother had, had the same kinds of experiences my mother did. I don't know about my great grandmother. I know some about her, but I don't know about her traumatic life. I know about my grandmother's traumatic life, and I know a bit about my mom's traumatic life. And of course, that's what happens. They get passed on. So it's not just us. That's how close we are as people, right? We share the love, we share hope, we share optimism, but we also share shorter telomeres. We share these dramatic and traumatic experiences that happened long ago. That's not just making it up. This is pretty clear. That's what's happening. There's a protein in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And it's really an important protein in our brains that's produced when we do certain things, like when we run, when we sit in a hot sauna, or we sit in an ice cold pool of water, or when we fast, or when we're fasting and we lift weights and we don't eat until, for 18 hours from our last meal to our first meal of the day, like intermittent fasting. Any of those kinds of things, like our ancestors did, like they couldn't open the fridge and just get a snack. They went sometimes, 20, 30 hours, or sometimes a couple of days without food. You can be assured that their brain-derived neurotrophic factor was rising in their brains. And what it was doing was promoting neuron growth. They were growing more neurons to do more things, to think, to move, to create, to speak, to analyze, to get higher order learning and analysis and those kinds of things. So that we've had a long history of that as human beings. And our ancestors that were just a few hundred years away from us were probably really experiencing, the growth of brain-derived neurotrophic factor in their brains that was keeping their neurons growing, and they weren't dying like they die today for a lot of us. And it stops them from dying, right, as well. I'm not a neuroscientist, so when I was first learning these terms like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and I didn't really know what it was, I had to look it up. I said, how do I remember this, BDNF? So I'm a runner. I still go out and I run, and I lift weights. I'm pretty active yet, and I've been most of my life. Brain-derived, so when I run, I used to think about this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. How do I remember that? And then I thought, it's like when this stuff is being poured in your brain, you're getting more neurons, and your neurons are getting stronger and more creative. You're becoming more creative, and so on. Brain is getting younger in a sense. So I said, well, when I run, I always imagine this big Indian guy in my brain with a big, barrel of BDNF. And as I ran, I said, this big darn native fella is pouring BDNF on my brain, so my brain's getting better and better as I run, right? So it's the story anyway. So we know that, being in a place where you're being intimidated, being bullied, and you're getting a lot of social stress, has different kinds of effects on the brain. And in one instance, what it does is it increases the BDNF in the brain, and that's good, because the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, what it does is it protects our brain's neurons from dying, and the neurogenesis happens. More neurons grow so that we're protected. That's exactly what the brain's supposed to do. We know that also, though, that when the bullying goes on for too long, and the intimidation goes on for too long, and for some people they're more sensitive to it too. It activates, genes in the front part of the brain that produce these higher levels of social anxiety and withdrawal and isolation and depression. Right? It's pretty clear, when it's been studied. These different studies suggest that BDNF, and it has all this signaling that goes on to the brain, like your different chemicals go up in your brain, like your cortisol, which is kind of flight and fight, and of course your norepinephrine, which is kind of an alert chemical, right, are all kind of activated. And when those are activated, and this is bullying is happening, of course, then what happens is this, what they call a pathophysiology of depression and suicidal behavior then begin to take place, right? So now we know a little bit about why suicide may be high among Native folks, right? Because there's a lot of, it's not just depression or suicidal behavior. We see here that social stress, chronic stress are the key pieces here. And if we don't have any firewall for that, which a lot of us don't, because we don't practice our traditional activities like we used to. It doesn't surprise me anymore that depression is one of the highest mood disorders among Indigenous folks, and also suicidal behavior, ideation, and completion of suicide. It's no surprise to me anymore. So they say, well, of course, the stress and the conditions and hate and marginalization, historical trauma, that stuff is all there. But now we know a little bit about the mediated signaling that's happening. That's happening, when we're bullied, the increase of BDNF, but also the activation of these genes that create social anxiety, and of course, moving then to depression and suicidal behavior. But it can be disrupted, of course. How do we do that? How do we increase BDNF? Well, first of all, what does it do? Well, it improves our long-term memory, our higher order thinking, so we can solve complex problems, our higher order of learning, so that we can be introduced to complex, problems and ideas and learn about them. And of course, as I said before, it's like that big darn native fella pouring this BDNF on my brain. It's like Miracle Grow for the brain. And there's a book written by a guy named John Rady about this particular, trying to remember the name of the book right now. I'll remember it in a sec, but he writes about it. That's what he calls it, right? BDNF also does this, and I've already told you about this too, but I didn't say it develops new connections, which it does, repairs failing brain cells and protects the healthy brain cells. So how do we do that, right? So I'm talking about mindfulness and contemplative practices. How do we do that? Now, this is a Navajo grandma out there on the road, probably 85, 86 years old. She's got her number on, her water bottle, her Nikes, and her traditional, headgear, and her skirt and everything. She's out there on the road, right? Mimicking what our ancestors would have done back then, even at that age, right? There's something called the grandmother hypothesis. So if you've got a pen and pencil, just write that down, the grandmother hypothesis, and look it up. I'll just kind of tell you very briefly that grandmas used to live a longer time, and they still live a longer time, because part of one of the hypotheses is that when moms were out and aunties were out and all the kids were left behind, moms and aunties were out there gathering berries, hunting, and doing the things they need to do to bring home food. So grandmas had to live longer and be alert to take care of the kids, right? That's been a pretty normal function and operation among all human cultures around the world. It's just now grandma doesn't get to do that, or grandma gets to do that too often when people abandon the kids, so many kids. And grandma then already has, some conditions that are health conditions like diabetes, or maybe is not, physically functional like she used to be because of, the industrialized world we live in that doesn't promote, health. So things that increase the brain-derived neurotrophic factor that will protect our brains cells and increase our brain cells, number of cells, is exercise. Exercise is critical. We need to be doing it, several times a day, and walking at least, 15,000 steps a day and up to 18,000 steps a day. Avoiding sugar. Sugar is toxic. It's poison. It decreases our BDNF. That's one of the things that, we got introduced to by Europeans, is sugar. So sugar is all over the place, and all the cooking and all the foods we eat, and it's hidden in so many products, and we add it to all of our traditional cooking. Used to be people would make wojapi before without any kind of sugar. Now they dump it into the things like that. So those are an example. Fasting, something our ancestors did that many of us don't do. Fasting on a regular basis every day for 18 hours a day is taken the world by storm, called intermittent fasting. Huge. And then of course regular fasting. We know from the research now that if we fast for 3 days for 72 hours, most of our immune system, gets peaked to the point where it's like almost been reprogrammed or restructured, right? That's one of the things that keeps us very healthy. I was just looking at a study here a couple of days ago about lymphomas and about how powerful fasting is for lymphomas, but that doesn't really get out to the research, although this was an article that was published on PubMed. Doctors don't tell you, if you've got genes, for lymphoma or whatever, you should be fasting. That should be part of your lifestyle, right? They don't tell you that, right? But our ancestors didn't have anyone tell them that. They just fasted for most reasons. They were spiritual. They just didn't have enough food because, we didn't have grocery stores, and sometimes the buffalo were hard to get, and sometimes the droughts that came didn't leave us too many things to gather. So we got that in our memory bank of DNA that comes down to us, just like mom's telomeres came down to us. Our ancestors' genes came down to us in terms of our fasting. Mental stimulation, very important. Our ancestors did that by walking through the hills, walking up and down the sides of mountains, swimming across cold pools of water, ducking under branches, trying to outthink, the game they hunted, trying to outthink one another in the games in the village, trying to, figure out problems, how to, get more food, or how to, do something spiritually different, or how to learn how to talk with other tribes, or with other groups of people that were coming in. So there's communication. There was constant simulation happening, right? They couldn't go Google it, right? They just had to sit down and do a lot of, analysis of situations. Sleep. I mentioned sleep. We don't, as I said earlier, there's so many things to sleep that's so important, right? I'm not going to talk too much about that right now. I'll mention it as we go on. Something very important about increasing BDNF is eating fatty fish like salmon or trout or wild game, like buffalo, like deer meat, anything that can, a lot of those wild games have higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, which of course protect the brain and reduce inflammation, and of course increase BDNF. Again, you see all these things are very much traditional kinds of things. Anti-inflammatory foods could be turmeric, could be, up here they call them Saskatoons, or back home we used to call them June berries or choke cherries or buffalo berries, we used to call them back in Fort Berthold. Eating those kinds of things, anything with that kind of a bit of bitterness, is one of the things that the plant uses, or the berry uses to protect itself against from us eating it, right? I mean, the plants don't want to be eaten, so they have a kind of a mild toxic substances that they protect themselves with. And things like turmeric and blueberries and other kinds of things are anti-inflammatory foods. Mild bioenergetic stress, like the hot sauna, sitting in a hot sauna, or sitting, sitting in a sweat lodge is good, but the research shows that that we have to be sitting in a hot sauna maybe 5 times a week and jacking it up to 190 degrees, for 20 minutes, and then get out, and then we get the effect of it. Or sitting in a cold pool of water, taking a cold shower at the lowest cold setting for 5 minutes in the morning. With those, especially what the cold showers does is it increases what they call our brown fat, right? We get rid of the white fat, and then we increase the brown fat, which then brown fat increases, it makes us more muscular, and much stronger and leaner looking. So mild bioenergetic stress really kind of is a number of things, like fasting or eating certain foods that that kind of stress our genes or our cells a little bit, and so on. Meditation and mindfulness, what I'm kind of here to talk about, is another way to increase BDNF. And of course, probiotic foods. Probiotics and probiotic foods. Probiotics are, I should have taken this off, but probiotics, manufactured probiotics the last research I looked at don't seem to do much good. But the things that are really important are prebiotic foods, like eating things that have a lot of fiber, like oatmeal and beans, a lot of beans, eating a lot of beans every day, and a lot of oatmeal every day, and eating plants that have a lot of fiber, probiotic foods. Things like kimchi, if you ever eat kimchi, are really good. You can go either way with yogurt, that kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff doesn't survive the acidity of the stomach, so you have to eat them all the time. Some of the probiotics are a lot stronger, and of course, Western science is working on probiotic supplements that are probably going to be a game changer for a lot of people in terms of preventing things like Alzheimer's disease and different kinds of illnesses and diseases. So in this part of the medicine wheel, the mind is what I call decolonizing the mind with traditional healing contemplative practices. Again, I'm not going to go through this too slowly. One of the 12 practices that I kind of came about in the literature, and then when I looked at, of course, traditional stories and stuff, are these practices that can help heal emotions, reset our genetic expression, and facilitate healing in a number of different kinds of ways. Running, dancing, and singing. We were meant to run, we were meant to dance, we were meant to sing. That's pretty clear when I look at the research. Not just because it feels good, but because it does a number of things that make us feel good. Sleep, we have to do sleep, enough so that our bodies, our circadian rhythms are balanced, right? And so that there's some processes in our brain that take place where our brain has its own lymphatic system, where when we sleep, the brain relaxes and kind of opens up, and there's a cleaning fluid. I forget the name of the brain's fluid that comes through, and it cleans out a lot of the molecular junk in the brain, including not axons, but gosh, I'll remember in a sec here again. But cleaning out the brain, and preventing, you know, all this junk building up in the brain, you know, which are some of the markers of Alzheimer's disease. Laughter and humor. We didn't really realize until now, until looking at some of the research, I didn't realize how important laughter and humor was. And laughter and telling jokes, telling funny stories and sacred clowns and that sort of stuff, how critical it is for the society and for indigenous people. Yeah. Collectivism, being together and you know, working together. You know, we've got a gene for that. I'll talk about that in just a second here. And then fasting and intermittent fasting, of course, meditation, adaptive stress, as I mentioned, which is called mild bioenergetic stress. Sauna, sweat lodge, produces what they call heat shock proteins. And I'll talk about that, and of course, being outside. Well, what about running? Running improves our physical fitness and our mental health and in our brain's working memory and processing speed. It's critical for that, right? So running, getting our heart rate up is critical, right? Whether we're biking or swimming or walking up a hill, or if you can't run or someone's in a wheelchair, maybe they're healthy enough to sit in a sauna and, you know, to get their heart rate up, right? Your brain will read that, your body will read that, just like you're working out. Running also improves the brain's executive function. I've taken down a lot of other benefits here because of the time. Improves the brain's executive function, our ability to delay gratification, not to take that extra piece of fried bread or chocolate cake, or, you know, to want something, and to avoid distraction, to stay focused, right? And today we have an epidemic, a pandemic of distraction that exists in the world because of all of the cell phones and all the other things that compete for our brain, which of course stresses our brain. And running also improves cognitive flexibility, moving from one cognitive task pretty smoothly to the next without getting tripped up. This is critical for kids. This is why running and exercise and movement, all these things I've talked about so far, are very important for kids. Mindfulness and meditation is very important, but also play is very important for cognitive flexibility, and so on. So it also increases BDNF, we know about, but this is something to take away. This is a takeaway too. When you think about how much depression there is among the people you work with, one of the things that we know is that running is one of the most powerful medicines, you know, that can be used for anxiety and depression disorders. This, and why that is because we know that regular endurance exercise, I'm talking about that as running for 30 minutes at about, 10 miles an hour, or, about to get your heart rate up to about, close to between 70 and 80% of its maximum rate. You get it up that high. What happens is that, there's going to adaptations in what they call kynurenine metabolism, right? Don't have to remember that, but just remember that once you start running and that you regularly, that protects, you from depression by increasing another kind of kynurenine aminotransferase, CAT, right? So then increases that expression. Once that's increased, there's a shift away from a neurotoxin, kynurenine, right? KYN. KYN is the culprit here that's going to cause a depression. It's neurotoxic, right? Produces then a less form of toxicity called kynureninic acid. So running increases CAT, which takes care of the neurotoxic kynurenine, produces KYNA, which of course then protects us from depression. So if you haven't known that before, if you're a counselor, if you're a therapist, I really strongly recommend that, exercise and endurance exercise should be part of the protocol for people you work with. There's just no way around it. I mean, if you don't want to, be loading folks with antidepressants and anti-anxiety, medication, there's a very traditional practice for it. So you see this guy running out in the desert here. That was me when I was younger. So I'm just kidding. All right, so we'll go on to the next one here. What about dancing? Dancing I consider to be a mindfulness, just like running, a mindfulness exercise, a meditative exercise. And what it does here, these are some UROCs. I used to be a professor at Humboldt State University, which is now called Cal Poly Humboldt in Arcata, California. So I was in UROC territory in Northern California. From 2009 to 2014, I was a professor there. So I used to go up and visit the UROCs all the time, the Hoopa and Wiots and Fort Smith people. And so I knew a lot of Indian people from that area. So that's why I put this particular picture in there. Anyway, we know that, singing increases these levels of endocannabinoids, AEA, OEA, and PEA, in this particular sample of females, and enhances the mood. Endocannabinoids are, really critical for us, to be activated. Dancing improves the mood. Cycling on a bike increases another kind of endocannabinoid. Also has positive effects. So a part of it is the exercise, the movement, getting the heart rate up, and then feeling good. There's a release that happens, right? People used to call them endorphins, right? We know endorphins are involved, but it's a little more. We know more now that it's endocannabinoids. And a cannabinoid is just kind of like, your own marijuana system in the brain that, that sense of release, right? So the most beneficial activity in the study, though, I really thought was like, because you had that music going on. I don't know. I didn't quite hear the whole thing. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was what kind of dance was going on, what song was being sung. But anyway, talking about, that singing was the most beneficial activity, right? And of course they had, people from local choirs that enjoyed the activity, but think about it, how much our ancestors used to sing. All the songs they had, sneak up, just not just powwow songs, all these kind of ceremonial songs, all these songs, that they used at different times. And then when we're doing those things, right, what we see from the data is that there's an increase, in these endocannabinoids, which improve our mood, reduce our stress and anxiety, enhance our memory. Wow, think about that, those dendritic spines and that chronic stress, what it does to break those dendritic spines in that earlier slide. But think about Alzheimer's. I did a chapter just this summer and submitted it for publication in a book called about indigenous aging. And I talked about healthy, or just about aging, health, but I wrote about healthy indigenous aging. And when I looked at the research in North America and Canada and the US, wasn't too looking too good for elders. As we get older, the rates of Alzheimer's and dementias are starting to rise and rise. And of course, Indians are leading everybody in that category, and it's expected to rise. But think about that, how to protect the brain. Or you already know that protecting the brain by running. You already know now that protecting the brain by singing and dancing, right? These kinds of things are things that are going to raise the endocannabinoids and protect your brain function. Again, I've talked to many groups, a lot of social workers, a lot of psychologists, a lot of mental health workers, and so on. I said, this is something that may not be in the Western world, but these are what these indigenous people did. They did a lot of dances. And of course, we know now when they do these dances that endocannabinoids rise in the brain, they protect them, improve the mood, reduce stress, protect the brain function, reduce pain. The power of dance here. These are some, I think these are man dance out there dancing. And there's a lot of research. I took a deep dive into the dance science. And we know now that there's so much improvements in memory and attention and focus. There's one study I was kind of interested in, and I read about it, was about ballroom dancing. Older people who are experiencing some kind of mild cognitive impairments and a little bit of early forms of dementia, after 10 months of ballroom dancing class, their memories began to go up. Of course they would, right? Not only did they enjoy the exercise, but they had to do different kinds of steps, listen to music. So they're using a number of different kinds of things, in their brain: taste, touch, smell, sight. And of course, you have to dance with a partner, because one of the things we know is that, from the research that's gone on, is that dance has been a big part of who we are as human beings, and our collective experience for thousands of years. Our bodies and brains evolved to dance in synchronized unison. That's what we do. Have you ever seen that team dancing? A long time ago, I used to watch that when those guys used to do team dancing quite a while ago. Now they still do that now. But they used to do buffalo. When I grew up as a kid on Fort Berthold, I remember, way before, when they didn't have no halls or anything like that, they used to have these big circus tents. don't know if anybody remembers that. They'd come up there and they'd have a big kind of circus tent, and they dance in there. And these guys used to come from different tribes. And they do buffalo dances and eagle dances and bear dances and snake dances. And when I was doing my PhD at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, I used to go up to north and dance with the Ojibways and the Menominees and the Stockbridge Munsees and the Winnebagos, all those groups, and they used to do snake dance. Geez, it was really a cool dance. It was the 4 cycles of life where the snake was born, and then was young, and then got adult, then it got into old age, then it had to shed its skin and go into the spirit world, right? So you used to sing all those 4 parts. So you had to listen for those parts, and then when you're going across to the spirit world, every time you reached a certain place there, you had to change your course, go in that. So everybody was dancing like a snake. They were all following each other. And there was a leader weaving in and out, going circles, going in, just all kinds of complex things. And at the end, then we'd all have to dance across. I was a grass dancer, so I'd dance across like that from one drumstick to the next. And we'd dance across that and go back and forth, but the singers would really sing hard to help us get into the spirit world, right, where our relatives were. And we all did it in unison. It felt natural. Then, of course, that made me think back to when I was a kid back in Fort Berthold, when I was, just like about 7, 6 years old, watching all these dancers dance in this unison like that. Just the same way, if you've ever seen those birds fly, thousands of birds fly all together like that. They're kind of flying like they call that murmurations. Thousands of them, they just, like that. And then if you look in the ocean, you see these fish all standing like this. They call it schooling, all in unison. So that's how we're kind of related to these other ancestors, these other relatives, right? Buffalo, they all run a certain way. Fish swim a certain way. They all do that kind of dance. Birds fly in unison, those kinds of things. And humans do best when they do that. And of course, when we're in unison, it makes us stronger, right? But they don't, those kinds of knowledge was taken away during colonization. So we don't do those dances like that anymore. Laughter is the same way. It's like laughter increases our brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And we know now from research is that, it's down to DNA differences. Some of us, came from cultures where we had funny bone genes, right? That's where we kind of like to tease and laugh, tell jokes, hear funny stories. We had sacred clowns. And this particular study found that people with short alleles in our genes, and this particular gene called 5-HTT-LPR, smile or laugh more, tease more, right? They like to be around other people or telling jokes, telling funny stories, right? These trickster stories about, how this stuff goes on. And there's always that teaching at the end. People who have longer alleles, that means a different kind of genetic variant, don't laugh as much. They're not as amused as much, right? And not surprisingly, it's people that come from Western European countries, right? They somehow didn't find the world funny or something. I'm not sure why, but the people like myself and my own family, I know we got these short alleles, right? We flourish in a positive environment where there's a lot of laughter, a lot of smiles, a lot of hugging, a lot of jokes, a lot of pranks, teasing, those kinds of things. A lot of us, even the cultures, have teasing built into it. Certain ones you can tease, certain ones you can't tease, and certain kinds of ways you could tease. Gosh, I remember when I was growing up as a little kid, some of my grandmas used to tease us, man. And they teased us, in a ways to kind of, embarrass us, and they would say things to us, and, we'd get all, blushy and all that sort of stuff, but that's kind of was one of their jobs, They would just all laugh about it, we were little kids, young kids, especially when we got into junior high or becoming young men, they would kind of control our desires and our appetites by kind of with teasing, and kind of question us and that kind of thing. But that wasn't, it was a form of culture, right? Today, we don't see that. I grew up around that. I was kind of fortunate to see that, as I grew up. So what we know now from this particular gene that, if you're an indigenous person, you're very likely to have this particular gene. That collectivist cultures like indigenous people are more likely to have people who carry this funny bone gene or this short allele, right? Across 29 nations. And this is a global study by Joan Chiao. We know that laughter, improves our memory and our learning, lowers our cortisol, I mentioned earlier, which is our fight fight chemical, relaxes our blood vessels, boosts our T cells, which improves our immune system, releases endorphins, but also raises our endocannabinoids. Think about that. Laughter is protecting your brain. Laughter preventing Alzheimer's. Laughter, is, and probably that's why I think a lot of people, used to laugh, a long time ago. Think about how they laughed at death, how they counted coup on death, or how they counted coup and laughed at hunger and those kinds of things. That's one of the things that they learned to do. I mean, I noticed that when I was a sun dancer, when you'd be in there, that sometimes you'd be sitting there without food and water for a lot of times, and sitting with a lot of guys, first thing we start doing is, after we got done praying, we have a small moment, we kind of joke and talk about kinds of things that kind of helped, get us to the next point, in the dance, that's what's happening, that laughter is increasing our endocannabinoids, which kind of blunting our pain, but it's also traditional, it's also cultural, that humor. So what about sleep? It's my unemployed res dog here. It's resting. So we need sleep. If we get our sleep disrupted, our circadian rhythms suffer. Our circadian rhythm clock breaks down, and we're at increased risk for all these things. Our brain actually shrinks, and diabetes and so on. And you have to think about how much time we spend on our cell phones and on our laptops and those kinds of things, and TVs, and we've been colonized by those kinds of things. We don't look at the stars at night before we go to bed. We're watching Netflix or something, or Yellowstone before we go to bed, or whatever it is, Amazon, whatever. I remember when I was a kid, these guys, these older guys, used to go outside before they went to bed, and they'd sit outside, and they'd kind of, it was getting late, and they'd be looking at the stars, kind of talking Indian, kind of smoking a cigarette or drinking a cup of coffee back then, looking at the stars. And then, of course, later on, they'd be talking about, how they related to the stars, and, how they thought about these things, they would say, right? Sleep is crucial for children's development. Learning disabilities are affected, our learning abilities are affected. Growth hormones are really important because at the time of sleep, because it helps release those. And of course, infection-fighting proteins, would protect us from, COVID-19, for instance. I mentioned sauna and sweat lodge, and of course, that's the mild bioenergetic stress I talked about. But what's really interesting and important about this is that it produces something called heat shock proteins, HSP, right? And they are vital to our protein structures. When our proteins misfold in our body, right, in our brains and our, and so on, as they're being produced, our protein structure, we get sick quicker, and chronic stress, trauma, being unsafe, feeling unsafe, being marginalized, all has an effect on our protein structure. When we sit in a hot sauna, or we sit in an ice cold pool, when we fast, when we run, on an empty stomach, or lift weights on an empty stomach, our heat shock proteins rise in our cells. The more we get, the better off we are. The more heat shock proteins we have, if you're someone to draw and take a look at your cell, your cells, and see how many heat shock proteins are. If you've got a lot of them, that means, wow, good chance of longevity, disease protection, healthy skeletal muscles. And you can be sure that our ancestors probably had high heat shock proteins when they weren't in a starvation mode, when they were in a mode where they were moving all the time, they weren't eating so much, they were laughing a lot of time, they were sleeping well, they were eating, good foods, and of course they were dancing and singing, and of course involved in prayer and meditation. Their heat shock protein levels were going up in their cells, probably, and the things that weren't killing them weren't cancers and diseases. There were things like infections, or of course, different kinds of contagious diseases like malaria, or something that exists in other parts of Turtle Island, or even further south, I should say. So fasting is the same thing, right? Our ancestors fasted a lot. And of course, in this particular slide here, it says that this priest is among these people, and he's seen them, without food for several days. And he said, I saw these Montagnais Indian hunter-gatherers of 1636, where this missionary came in. He said, I saw them in their hardship and labor suffer with cheerfulness. And here he's suffering even more. I found myself with them threatened with great suffering. And they noticed him and said, you know, we're going to be sometimes 2 days, sometimes 3, sometimes more without eating for lack of food. They're telling him, you know, take courage. Let thy soul to be strong to endure suffering and hardship. You know, something they had to do. They had to practice. They couldn't go to the fridge. They couldn't go to the store, you know. This was part of their DNA that they passed on down to us. You know, they had to be strong to endure suffering and hardship and keep thyself from being sick or sad, I should say. Otherwise, thou wilt be sick. See how we do not cease to laugh, even though we have little to eat. So in what I was saying earlier about that gene, that it's called the serotonin transporter gene, or the 5-HTT-LPR gene, the funny bone gene, is that this is something that protected us from starvation or from hardship or from loss. Is that, you know, I don't know, say creator, you know, or you could say, you know, whoever, you know, the Conchula, or whoever you want to say, maybe gave us this ability to kind of laugh at death and sickness and hunger and those kinds of things. Because when we laugh at those kinds of things, it raises our endocannabinoids, and our pain relief comes because it protects us from pain and hardship, protects our brain, you know, and makes our immune system stronger. This is what our, excuse me, this is what our ancestors did, right? So it's traditional to fast. It's traditional to laugh, right? All the benefits that come with it: improved glucose regulation, the loss of abdominal fat, and maintaining your muscle mass, reduced blood pressure, your heart rate gets better, improved learning and memory, motor functions. It protects the neurons against all these different things like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke, Huntington's disease, which is why you probably didn't see that among the people before, and you still don't see those things among hunter-gatherer populations today that you know do a lot of they don't really call it fasting, but they call it calorie restriction. They don't eat that much every day, you know. They eat some days good, other days they may go a couple of days with real low, and then they may eat some more, right? So this is what Mark Mattson found, is that what, you know, not eating is beneficial for our health because it imposes the challenges to our cells, and our cells take that challenge on. You know, they adapt and they enhance their ability to cope with stress and resist disease. Like I said, I intermittent fast every day for about, today I was about 20 hours. It's kind of over my time because I was in my, you know, all these meetings today. But, you know, our ancestors did that, you know, because there was food shortages, right? I've written about this topic before, about fasting and what happens, you know, when they had to practice, you know, in a big village where they're, you know, they hadn't eaten for a long time. Maybe they got a couple of buffalo, you know, and then they had to eat that, and they had a feast at first, but then they dry all that meat and eat it slow and kind of portion it, you know, until they could get more dried meat or whatever they could trade for, or get some corn, you know, from this group, or beans from that group, or whatever it is, you know, because these tribes traded like that. So it's, you know, it wasn't a party every day that people were living. It was tough. But so what had happened though, of course, like I said, is that it improved our DNA. I mean, our genetic response to hunger, to sadness, to fear, you know, so that we could coup on these things. Being outside is the same thing. It's very important, very important. You know, there's all these things that we get from being outside too as well. This is my second youngest daughter meditating, and she, you know, like I said, all my girls meditate, and she's now 10. She was probably about 5 in this picture here. So they all start pretty early. I haven't had it doing it lately, you know, so I shouldn't be saying they do it all the time. Over the pandemic, they did a lot more, but then kind of as we're coming out of that, you know, everyone's getting busy, so they're not doing as much as they should. But it's really important, because when we start meditating, you know, there's some really important changes that happen in our brain. Something called white matter changes in our brain, and it begins to increase after only 11 hours of practice. So 30-minute practices, 22 sessions, you know, you're going to start to see the white matter in the brain take place, you know, increase. And white matter is very important because it boosts the connectivity in the brain, where the brain talks to each other. And of course, it protects us against things like Alzheimer's. because one of the things that happens in dementias is that white matter that's around, it's the fatty white matter that's around our nerve cells that go stretch across our brain, can be, if we have an autoimmune disorder, sometimes our own body can attack that, what they call myelin sheath, and that's that white matter, that fatty matter here that I'm pointing at here. And we want to grow that back, right? So we want to meditate, we want to run, we want to sleep well, we want to sit in a hot sauna or take a cold shower or fast or those kinds of things. But this is just meditation. So more is better. 45 minutes of practice per day for 8 weeks changes major brain structures associated with memory, sense of self, empathy, and stress, and it protects our brain. I know how important it is for me, so I practice. I was doing 2 hours a day. I kind of come down a little bit to about an hour and a half a day, but I practice, even during my office. Just talking to my confidential assistant, my executive assistant, before she left. She said, we need to start doing meditation again. I said, yeah. I said, that's important. I said, you know what I do in between meetings? I get off my email and I open up YouTube and I go to a Vipassana setting for 15 minutes, and I take 15 minutes just to meditate, right? But meditation is different for me these days because I don't like to use it just for stress, because it seems like, it takes away the spiritual part of it. I like to use it in a very spiritual way too as well. So that's why I kind of increase myself. Not I'm just doing stress, but I'm trying to find a sense of enlightenment, and a sense of compassion and do good, and help out, and lend myself to others that are in need. It takes that kind of compassion to do that. So more is better. What happens to the brain too is that it decolonizes conflict, right? When we do mindfulness practices. And mindfulness meditation activates what they call the insula in the brain that's activated here. It's in that, you see that in that crosshair there. When that part of the brain is activated when we're doing a lot of meditation, then it helps control our mental emotions and the regulation of our body's homeostasis. And it increases gray matter in the brain, which enables one to control negative emotions or negative thinking. And that's really critical for us when we, the way some of us grew up around a lot of trauma and a lot of racism and a lot of death, we're still seeing it, so insula, we want that activated, and meditation does it. Running will do it too, but I'm talking about meditation now too. So another part of the brain that, mindfulness increases, and it decolonizes our emotional intelligence, because when we meditate, it activates what they call the TPJ, the temporal parietal junction in our brains here. Imagine this is your brain, you're meditating. Once you're meditating, and you're doing it a lot, the ability of you to perceive the emotional and mental state of others is increased exponentially after a while. And that's important because we want to be able to read one another. We want to have the emotional intelligence if we're service providers, right? And read ourselves and our children. And it's hard to do when we've got so many things competing against, for our brain's attention. Imagine our ancestors, how activated this TPJ must have been, this junction must have been, because they had to have the ability to perceive the emotional mental state of everybody in the village in order to keep the village healthy. So all eyes were on one another to make sure everybody was okay, everybody was doing good, and so that someone could intervene at a very early stage, or if they were born into a situation where they knew already that this child may have a tough time, that they always kept an eye on this child. So you had all your clan uncles and brothers and grandpas and grandmas and your parents and all your extended relatives, always keeping an eye on, and when they named a child, they gave the child a certain name to kind of flourish, right? So if the child was going to have some issues or whatever, that was part of, understanding, the emotional and mental state of others. So meditation does all this stuff, right? All this research shows that it, helps with addiction, reduces anxiety, just a few days, improves, the brain function, leads to these changes like the white matter, gray matter. It rivals and surpasses a lot of antidepressants and anti-anxiety medications, reduces the me center. It's not about me anymore, it's about all of us. So think about that, how, indigenous people, how all of our tribes, had to, it wasn't about me, it's about us. We had to survive because it was about us, not about me. And that the brain's, me center, I'll talk about that in just a second, shrunk down so that we could actually engage one another, and preserves the aging brain. So how do we do that? This is my oldest daughter. When she was 2 years old, I was living in Northern California at the time, and she really caught on to meditation fast. So we know how many hours of meditation now from the science it takes to have these really amazing changes. Well, beginners, 100 hours of total, practice. That's, meditating every day for an hour for 100 days, for instance, or meditating a half hour every day for 200 days, right? Or any, that you can do the math on that. Meditators for 1,000 total hours, right? It takes a while to get to that point, Even if you meditated 2 hours a day for a whole year, that's only going to give you 720 hours of meditation, and still be, 280 hours short of 1,000 hours. So you see, it builds up. Experienced meditators, 5,000 hours. Wow, that's 5 times as much as I just said. And lifetime meditators, 10 times as much as I said. And meditating 2 hours a day for a full year gives you 720 hours. So think about that. It's a lot of hours. What does 100 hours get you? Well, your neural and hormonal indicators of lessened stress reactivity. Neural meaning that you see changes in parts of your brain that, like, for example, in a lower part of your brain called the amygdala, the lower part of your brain, which kind of codes at least one thing it codes for. It's more complex than I'm making it sound. Codes for anxiety, and it codes for fear and stress and fight or flight behavior. That lessens down. What about your hormonal indicators? Well, your levels of cortisol may go down. You'll feel less anxious. Your levels of norepinephrine and epinephrine may go down. You'll feel less, you're less hyperactive, and stronger emotional regulation. When you hear or see something, you're more calm, more relaxed. You don't go into this frantic state or just overwhelmed state, right? Get stronger. Introception, the ability to sense your internal states, like your beating of your heart, the processing of food in your belly. What's your liver doing, right? What's your kidneys doing, right? You start to get that ability just to sense that. I'm not saying you're going to be a master at that, but that comes with practice. What about 1,000 hours of meditation? This is my class that I had when I was a professor at Humboldt State University. In case you don't know, I'm the guy in front there with the sunglasses on. I forgot I had my sunglasses on when they took this picture.
Hey, Mr. Yellowbird, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you wrap up? We have a ceremony that was supposed to start about 20 minutes ago. And
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. All right. So I'll finish up with these ones then, and then I'll let you go. Sorry about that. 1,000 hours of meditation practice. Your brain is going to have 7.5 less years of aging. There's an increased connectivity between your amygdala and your prefrontal cortex, so that you can regulate your emotions better. The nucleus accumbens. Nucleus accumbens. I don't know how you say that in Lakota, but nucleus accumbens is part of the brain that's associated with attachment and wanting, and it's the me center of the brain that shrinks. So it's not about me, right? Slower baseline breathing, better at solving working memory problems. 5,000 hours does this. You see this blue here? So the blue is the gray matter and the decrease. And you see the meditators don't have as much decrease in it. So the difference is that they have gray matter, and of course they have more gray matter than people who don't exercise. So that's small improvements in molecular markers of cellular aging, and I mentioned telomeres. Telomeres actually start to regrow, and you start to reverse aging. Decreased activation in the default mode network. Your mind is wandering all the time. And these are my girls again meditating. Off the chart synchronized gamma oscillations. You start getting into this place where, when you talk about just mentioned ceremony, imagine, that, you're transcending your human body now, because your brain has changed so much, and this activation is happening, and greater creativity and problem solving. all the way down, like I said, to shrunken, nucleus accumbens. It's all about us, not about me. The involuntary control over pain response happens. So I'm just going to end there, and I apologize for taking too much time. And thank you for inviting me to your conference.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. I'll leave and let you get to your ceremony.
Yes. Yeah, you can hear.
Thank you, Michael. All right. We're gonna move on here. Why don't we do the ceremony? So all the young guys, move these tables,